In this video, I'll describe authorship and when you should be a first author. Generally, first and second authors are similar, but there are some distinctions that are worth keeping in mind. The first author of a publication is really the intellectual owner of the idea, and often they've done the bulk of the work. The first author is also often the corresponding author. What does that mean? It means that they're the person who the editorial system that you're submitting to bothers, basically. They're the ones who get the emails, they're the ones who communicate progress, they're the ones that navigate that weird archaic system that seems like it was built from the 90s. Importantly, the corresponding author isn't always the first author, but very often is, because if the first author is the person that sort of owns that project, then very often they're the ones that are going to submit the manuscript and are going to deal with all of that administrative burden that is associated with submitting a manuscript. It's important to also know that when you're first author on a project, you own everything that's in that manuscript, even if you didn't write it. You own the good, the bad, the ugly. But what's also important is that you should be first author on publications that align with your fundamental research agenda and research trajectory. Often the first and second author are interchangeable, not in the sense of they're the same person, you can just swap back and forth, but in the sense that they've both contributed significantly to a project. The second author is still the person that is going to have some intellectual ownership and honestly a lot of intellectual ownership over the ideas of the manuscript. The first and second author together are seen as the folks who are championing the ideas within the manuscript. They're ultimately the ones that are responsible. Technically, everyone is responsible, but when something goes amiss or when credit is due, the first and second authors are often the ones who get the bulk of the praise and also the criticism. People who are an author on a manuscript, no matter where they fall in the line, have contributed significantly to that manuscript such that they're attributed as an author. They helped write it, they helped make it real, they helped establish the evidence base that that project is based on. What's important about all the authors, and especially the authors that are sort of third on down, is that their contribution should be clear. If you find yourself in a position where you're third author, fourth author, fifth author, at very least in your head, have clarity around what your contribution is. It's important to know that effort does not mean credit. If I'm a graduate student and I'm doing a lot of analysis and it's a lot of hard work, that doesn't necessarily mean that I came up with the research question, found funding for the project, collected the data. It means that I have a certain piece and I'm contributing to the overall project, but I'm not necessarily running the entire enterprise as the first or second author might be. Hard work is important and necessary, but it's not the same as credit. It's not the same as establishing an idea. One of the core things about authorship conversations is to have them early and to have them often enough if things change. When you have a conversation early, you establish with the team, with the rest of your colleagues, with the team who's going to work on the manuscript, who is generally responsible for which part of the project. And once you set that all out, once that's laid bare, then it emerges who should probably be first author. Now, often it's the case that the PI or whoever landed the grant or whoever really helped make the project happen, they're likely going to be the first or second author. Now, there are disciplinary differences here. It's important to have conversations about what authorship order means with folks in your discipline so that there's clarity around what it means to be first, second, or third author and what goes into each of those things. My guidelines here are fairly general and they're very grounded in the social sciences. So you have the conversation early and you have a sense of what authorship order is going to be, but that doesn't mean that things won't change. Often authorship order does change. Make sure that you're having conversations with your team so that there's clarity, because ambiguity is often what leads to hurt feelings, what leads to folks feeling that their contributions aren't being valued in these contexts. When in doubt, ask. If you would like to be first author on something, ask your PI or ask whoever you're working with, what would it take to be first author on a publication within your lab? And then let them tell you. What they say might be very similar to what I've said here, or it might be different. But either way, it's important to ask. Ask what it takes to be first author. Ask what second author is. People disagree. Often someone might feel that their contribution warrants them being a certain place in the authorship order, and someone might disagree. it is generally the role of the PI or whoever's managing that project to adjudicate those disagreements. But what's important is to distinguish between a disagreement that didn't break your way because there wasn't just an honest evaluation of the work versus being taken advantage of. You always want to make sure that how you contribute to a project is reflected in the final product. If you find yourself in a position where you're being asked to do a lot of the work in a project, but you're either not being included as an author or you're being included in a place that doesn't really make sense to you, have a conversation with the PI about it. It's important for you to have the conversation before the manuscript is submitted rather than after the fact. Because after it's submitted, it's very difficult and sometimes not quite possible to shift authors around. It is always within your power to walk away from a project that you feel is taking advantage of your labor. Sometimes this means that you're doing all of the first author work. You're doing all of the writing, you've done the bulk of the analysis, and someone might say, hey, thank you for that, but I would like this other person to be first author on that project. It's perfectly fine for you to say no. Now, often this might be politically tricky, but you'll find that it's better to just simply say no than to do that work and then feel resentful. I understand that sometimes those conversations are tricky, but it's better to be true to yourself and true to your contributions rather than just follow along in hopes that things will get better. Because unfortunately, the few folks who are abusive in this way will continue to be abusive no matter what. So it's better to walk away from it than to contribute to enabling them.